Okay, well, thanks very much, Martin, for this very generous introduction, and thanks very much as well to everybody for coming out on this cold and dark December evening at the close of, let's face it, what's been a tumultuous year, and thanks for coming along to participate in this evening's lecture. So I'm going to just return from standing on a freezing cold picket line because we're on strike at the moment. I hope to generate a little bit of warmth and light this evening. And I'm delighted that you all at least delayed getting involved with the Wonder Stuff, which I think are playing at the O2 Arena this evening. So thanks for that. So infrastructure then is once again at the heart of our national political and economic moment. It's getting portrayed now as a central problem and potential solution to a long-standing set of social and geographical inequalities in the UK and a very highly centralised governance structure. And these are issues that have troubled the UK for many, many decades, arguably. We've seen it as a problem when we refer to this uneven distribution of public expenditure on infrastructure across the UK and its devolved nations. This has been considered unfair. It's left many parts of the country lacking investment, unable to realise new and sustainable paths to prosperity. And our centralised national government has prioritised the needs, arguably, of London and its city region as the engine of national economic growth. And crucially as well, the generator of much tax revenue and receipts that have been crucial. And also, of course, London and the city and its city region are the seats, if you like, of UK political and economic power. And we've started to see as well that infrastructure has become part of the solution to try and resolve these kinds of problems. So before the general election, the then Conservative government promised what they termed an infrastructure revolution to bind the United Kingdom together through state activism and some big infrastructure projects. Commitments were further made around devolution of powers and resources, and this new idea then of levelling up local autonomy then in key areas such as bus and rail services. And we've seen as well in the exciting topsy-turvy world of the general election campaign, Labour too see infrastructure then and devolution to local communities then as central to addressing these societal challenges then around climate change, improving the quality of life and trying to reduce social and geographical divisions. Now such concerns then and the potential for infrastructure to address them then have become more pressing then since the crisis back in 2008. Following a whole series of reductions then in real wages, in living standards, in public expenditure since 2010. Some claim that uneven geographical access to infrastructure then has been part of the contributors to a feeling of discontent across the country that's been expressed back in the 2016 EU referendum 3 odd years ago and its aftermath. And amidst national debate about big infrastructure projects like High Speed Rail 2 and its initial phase of linking London to Birmingham, local government leaders in Cumbria, over in the northwest, argued that residents wanted any speed rail and claimed that the lack of a fair share of infrastructure investment contributed to the Brexit vote. Now, as symbols of state neglect and underinvestment, infrastructure has now become part of the response to dealing with these kind of problems, the so-called left behind people and places across the country. And this evening's lecture really tries to dig deeper behind these issues to try and understand these dynamics between social and spatial inequalities and centralised governance within the UK. It builds upon some research we did collaboratively as part of this iBuild Infrastructure Research Centre between 2014 and 2018, which was funded by two of the UK's research councils, Engineering and Physical Sciences and Economic and Social Research. And it was really a very innovative multidisciplinary collaboration amongst a whole group of scholars in Newcastle, Leeds and Birmingham that underpin this research. And as Martin thankfully did the salesmanship, it's been brought together then in the book, Financialising City, Statecraft and Infrastructure, which was jointly written then with Peter O'Brien, Tom Strickland, Graham Thrower and John Tomney. And I'd like to give my heartfelt thanks to them for their collaboration. And also all of them are here to deal with any difficult questions. So then, what we want to try and do in this evening's talk then, before we open it up for some reflections and some discussion then, is to really ask this question about whether trying to fix infrastructure in the London city region then is undermining the rest of the UK. Now the argument is that this geographically uneven infrastructure provision in the UK has been trapped into servicing the needs then of this engine, this national engine of growth then in the London City region. And that this particular situation is constraining the realisation of economic potential then in the rest of the country. We've split the talk up into 4 parts. First, we need to say what we mean by infrastructure and explain why it's important. Second, we want to try and look behind the headlines to look systematically at this uneven geography of infrastructure provision across the piece. Thirdly, we want to try and look at some of the explanations for this uneven geography, in particular these close relationships between social and geographical inequalities and centralised governance. And then lastly, we want to try and conclude on what it all means, how we might use infrastructure in different ways then to try and address the UK's very divided economic, social and political geographies at this point in time. Now, also to demonstrate our multidisciplinary dialogue that we're uniquely placed to have at Newcastle University around these issues, we'll then ask for some reflections from 2 of our colleagues here, renowned professors and experts at Newcastle, Simon Davudi from Planning and Richard Dawson from Civil Engineering, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussions at the end. Okay, so what then is infrastructure and why does it matter? It's certainly more than physical things like cables, electrical substations, railway tracks and so forth. And indeed Richard Dawson has argued that we need an approach to infrastructure that goes beyond bridges and that. It's much more important than that. It provides services that we all rely upon for our everyday lives. The kind of services like heat, light, hydration, shelter, connection, mobility. These are the things that enable our basic daily tasks of cooking, eating, resting, washing, communicating with each other and moving around on foot, bikes, cars, boats, trams and trains. Now, infrastructure underpins and connects all these sites for fundamental human and social activities. They're very important in terms of connecting together places that we live, learn, work and play across the world. And as we mentioned, infrastructure has kind of risen in importance in terms of being able to address some of these broader global challenges around economic restructuring, demographic shifts, technological transitions, rising inequalities and climate change. And infrastructure is made up of these unavoidably geographical connections between people, physical things, processes, resources and services. So if we think of a water system, for example, it includes a whole series of physical things like reservoirs and pipes. There's processes like treatment and purification. There's resources such as flows of water, and they provide essential services for us in terms of hydration and sanitation. And defining infrastructure, Matthew Bishop, who writes for The Economist, then has been very good in terms of this idea of economic arteries and veins, he calls it, infrastructure, allowing people, goods, commodities, water, energy and information to move about efficiently. Now, if you prefer, late night, or last week tonight, host John Oliver sees infrastructure then as anything that can be destroyed in an action movie. Alternative perspective on these things. More academically, we've got the idea that different disciplines and professions have their own views and think about infrastructure in different ways. So engineers, as we've learned through the I-Build process, then take this whole systems approach to infrastructure. They see systems of systems interacting with each other, providing strong interconnections with each other and providing these essential services. Economists tend to see infrastructure as what they call a public good, something that only the state can provide when markets fail. And for them, infrastructure is very important in terms of providing what they call externalities or spillover effects, such as connectivity, that are very important in influencing the benefits and costs for firms and households. And increasingly, as we mentioned now, financiers are getting in on the act. They see infrastructure then as assets and revenue streams, capable of supporting high levels of debt, with governments very closely involved then in terms of contracting, buying services from these financial institution consortia, but also being guarantors and regulators then of the services that they provide. Now, there are 2 basic kinds of infrastructure that we can identify. There's kind of economic or hard infrastructure, and here we can think about things like digital communication, energy, flood protection, transport, waste management and water. But that's also complemented by a growing interest in this idea of social or softer infrastructure. And this is things like education, health, legal and protective services. And there's a number of reasons why infrastructure matters, which we can identify. Firstly, it certainly shapes a whole set of activities, economic, social, cultural, political and environmental, that people in places can undertake. and it helps or hinders their abilities then to fulfil their capabilities and their well-being. Now increasingly, who owns, who manages, prices, governs infrastructure then determines what kind of infrastructure gets provided in places, how much people have to pay for it, under what terms and conditions, and where and when infrastructure is actually available to people in particular places. And lastly, infrastructure is important because it kind of expresses the nature of our national political economy. How much is the government committed to this common wheel of collective provision? And it's a vital thing, infrastructure, in our economy, in our society, our polity, our ecology, increasingly. Now, Jeremy Dodson, who's another writer on infrastructure, argues that there's been a kind of global infrastructure turn. Infrastructure has become a term du jour, if you like. A dramatic increase has accompanied infrastructure amongst business, government and the wider public then internationally. And this has been typified by, certainly in the academic sphere, then a very dramatic growth then in a series of published articles with infrastructure in their title since the mid-1990s. Now what's important about the current moment around infrastructure, because we've had them in earlier eras, but certainly in the current moment then, there's been a lot of claims of crisis. And this view then that local and national governments then have underinvested in infrastructure, that we've been struggling to fund, to finance, to govern infrastructure, to provide these essential services to people across the country. Gaps are being articulated by various interests that national governments are said to be unwilling or unable to fund. They're not willing to put up taxes to fund infrastructure. They're not willing to borrow money from various sources to be able to provide infrastructure that's needed. And gargantuan sums are being discussed here. So the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, for example, then, calculated that by 2030, the total global infrastructure investment requirements then for key sectors will amount to $71 trillion. It's about 58 trillion pounds. So that's the equivalent of something like 3.5% of the total annual gross domestic product globally then between 2007 and 2030. So those are truly mind-boggling sums that are being calculated in terms of these investment gaps. And what that sense of crisis, that articulation of crisis has done, is open the door then to external investment and from other financial, private sector and non-UK government institutions. And these financial actors are starting to see infrastructure then as critical, long-term, often monopoly assets, single suppliers of services that are able to support high levels of debt because of their long-term revenue streams. If you think about the bills that get paid from water, these are very, very long-term revenue streams that stretch over decades into the future. And they often offer these attractive combinations of financial returns, risk and maturity profiles. So we're starting to see the emergence then of a global infrastructure market. So moving away from the economist's vision then of a public good only provided by the state and government then, we're seeing a market being developed, constructed, widening and deepening over time, in an international context of low interest rates where investors are struggling to get return on their investments then. Investors are being attracted to these very low-risk sectors which can balance their portfolios with riskier investments and produce relatively good returns compared to things like commodities or shares. So you start to see a whole series of large-scale, international, often national government-led investors that are increasing their involvement in infrastructure. They often have these distinctive spatial signatures in terms of the geographies of their investments. And they include things like sovereign wealth funds, China Investment Corporation, for example, pension funds, financial services companies are getting increasingly involved in infrastructure provision then. So you're starting to see then today this idea of infrastructure being much more important, a growing interest and demand, if you like, on the side of local and national governments, but also the growing involvement then of these financial actors. And academics, of course, have to give these things a name, so we call it financialisation, the emergence then of these financial actors getting much more closely involved. And what this has been doing then, of course, is eroding and kind of changing the way in which infrastructure is understood from being just this simple public good that the state provides into becoming a kind of financial asset that is much more discussed, constructed, shaped in financial terms then for these kind of international private sector and government investors. And this transformation has very, very profound effects then for how infrastructure is funded, how it's financed and how it's governed. And public finance, that we would understand within local and national government then, has very long-term economic, social, political, environmental objectives and often very, very long-term timescales. but that kind of world of public finance is now colliding with private and commercial financial imperatives, which obviously has narrower aims of a financial kind, shorter-term time horizons as well, and that's producing some interesting and difficult issues to be discussed. Okay, so we're at the end of this part then, in the sense that we've covered now what infrastructure is. We understand why it matters a bit more, and now we can turn to understanding this uneven geography of infrastructure across the UK. Now, historically, the UK has experienced a very dramatic reduction in government expenditure. Public sector net investment, one of the key metrics for this kind of stuff, has been reduced by governments of both main political parties from its peak of over 7% in the late 1960s, 7% of GDP. We've fallen off this kind of calamitous cliff of public investment, bumbled along for a bit of an increase to the 2000s, and then it's fallen off again after the crisis. So in terms of this idea of a gap of crisis in the UK, we're feeling this acutely as an underinvested nation, if you like, in terms of infrastructure. And if we put ourselves in the UK in international context, so this is just looking at the level of what's called gross fixed capital formation, investment in infrastructure, we've lagged behind comparable major economies then across the piece in Canada, France, Germany and the US since about the 1990s. So the UK is this thick dotted line here. We were doing okay, holding our own, if you like, through the 70s. But then this has kind of fallen away, and we've lagged investment in these other major economy competitors internationally. And this kind of history of underinvestment, if you like, has left us pretty low down the rankings then of infrastructure quality that are undertaken by various international institutions. So we currently sit 28th place in the World Economic Forum's recent listing. Switzerland, Singapore and France occupy the top 3 slots, countries that invest much, much more in relative terms in their infrastructure. And when we dig down into the UK subnational level, then we start to see that there's a very spatially skewed and imbalanced geography of infrastructure investment. It's very, very skewed towards the globalised capital city region around London. Now, mapping this geographical distribution is not straightforward. It takes a lot of time and a book to work your way through. There are issues around data availability, trying to work out the location, structure, timing of infrastructure investments, and there's a whole lot more detail and caveats in there that you can get your teeth into if these things are of interest. But if we take just the broad figures to try and give you a sense of this uneven geography, we take our data then from the UK Treasury, our Finance Ministry. We can see that their public expenditure figures then for the period 2011-12 to 2015-2016 then show that public spending on infrastructure per head, we're kind of normalised, if you like, for the different sizes of the regions then, is the highest in London, followed by Scotland, with all the other parts of the UK then receiving comparatively less infrastructure investment. We look at other measures in the book, so this is only a taste of it, but widening that analysis, looking at other national data, reveals a very similar picture. So there's a national infrastructure and construction pipeline. Again, it identifies investment per head for a time period then, 2017-18 to 2020-21 across England. And again, the highest level then is in London, the lowest in Yorkshire and the Humber. And indeed, if we drill down into specific infrastructure projects then, we can see many of the largest scale and highest value new infrastructure projects. These are just the ones listed over £1 billion at the current time of calculation, ones that are underway, being planned, being argued about at the moment, tend to be either located in or connecting to the London city region. And these include things like HS2. This is probably a conservative estimate of what it will eventually cost if it gets built. It's undergoing review at the moment. Various crossrails and Thames Tideway super sewer that's been the subject of recent documentaries on its construction wonders. If we focus then and drill down into specific sectors, we start to see a very similar kind of story. Transport in particular then, something that's really meaningful to people's everyday lives in terms of getting around to live, work, play and learn. We can see that expenditure per head was substantially higher in London than elsewhere. London's the thick line across the top here compared to all the other regions, which stick out as a kind of correlation relative to per capita investment in London. And you've got the highest and fastest growing levels then in the London city region, rising to something like £300 per person, compared to less than £100 per person then in the East Midlands. So there is a distinctly uneven geography across the piece then in the UK. And we can look as well, because of course not all infrastructure investment is by national and local government. The private sector obviously plays a very big part in investment, particularly in sectors like energy, telecommunications and water, the privatised industry. And we can see data sources here then are a bit patchier, they're not as easy to get hold of in terms of understanding their geographies. One area we can explore is around the notion of private finance initiatives. So this is PFI, you might have heard of, from the 1990s onwards, and its successor, Private Finance 2. So these are mechanisms then that are used to kind of bring government and private sector together to fund infrastructure. And here the picture looks startlingly familiar. We've got a concentration then of these projects around London, as well as some concentrations then in the northwest and Scotland in relative terms, which has reduced their early reliance on the capital rather. And these examples, there's a lot more data and detail in the book, but the story comes across, I think, pretty clearly, certainly for our analysis. There's an uneven geography of infrastructure in the UK, with a very strong orientation then towards London and its city region. So where people live, work, learn and play in the UK then is serviced by very, very differentiated infrastructure systems. And this situation, if you like, is acknowledged then by national and city governments, by agencies, by private institutions and civic actors. And it results, as a consequence of what we were saying earlier about how infrastructure matters, in a very geographically unequal participation of people in economy, society, polity and culture. Life chances are shaped, well-being is shaped in very different ways across the country because of this uneven infrastructure provision. Now, of course, the big question that the book tries to tackle then is, why is this the case? Why have we got this such uneven and unequal geography then of infrastructure across the piece? So we're going to move on then to try and tackle this explanation then. And I think it rests on four related elements that we think fit together. They're closely connected points. The first one is as a result then of these long-standing social and economic disparities across the UK in geographical terms. The second one is the economic and political dominance then of London and the UK's very highly centralised governance structure. The third one, which is a bit more for the anoraks, but it's important, is the geographically skewed nature of project appraisal methodology. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then lastly then, the constraints then upon local governments then that have been attempting to try and fund, finance and govern their infrastructure investments across the country. So let's have a look at each of these in turn. So the first of which is this idea that the UK has a very, very highly uneven economic geography, very deep-rooted and long-standing social and spatial inequalities. As the UK has deindustrialised and evolved into much more of a service economy, our economic geography then has become much more concentrated in London and its city region. London's share of the national economy, for example, then increased from 4% to 23%, nearly a quarter of the total UK gross value added then, which is a measure of economic productivity then, between 1997 and 2015. Every other region reduced its relative share. So we've got a kind of hoarding or concentration, if you like, of economic activity within London. And historically, these social and spatial inequalities then have been very persistent and growing. So if we look at the coefficient of variance, so the difference, if you like, between the most and the least prosperous regions, this increased by nearly 7 points between 1871, if we take a long view, up to 2007. If we look at this index of gross domestic product, economic output in regions over that same period, if we call the UK 100, London's increased from something like 142 to 165, while the North East and Cumbria then fell furthest then from 94 to 75 over that long run period. So what you've got, and it's shown here by Duncan Smith's wonderful map about employment density then within the UK, is that you've got very entrenched historical trends that have kind of meant the UK now has ended up with a very hierarchical and monocentric economic geography dominated by the London city region. And you can see that the spatial spike, if you like, the employment concentration then, this high density of jobs then in London has kind of skewed, if you like, the economic geography then within the UK. Now, of course, this geographical concentration then has a very marked spatial footprint. And if we just look at the people having to suffer commuting in and out of London each day is starting to widen. It's becoming a broader geography, as colleagues in Kurds have been studying over many, many years. And this, of course, increases people's reliance then upon effective and cost-efficient public transport system. So once again, we're back to infrastructure to support the very economic geography that we find ourselves in within the UK context. Now, for some, we won't mention any names, we'll come into them in the discussion perhaps, this uneven geography is economically rational. It's an outcome then of market processes, it's the efficient and productive way to organise the UK economy. Large-scale infrastructure investments then should be focused on this most populated and largest centre of economic activity and tax generation in the UK. In this view, we'd all be poorer without London's economic might, and we should just accept the use of general taxation that we gather from across the UK to invest in infrastructure to support growth within the capital. London's growth, its advocates argue then, supports and complements expansion elsewhere in the UK through these kind of trickle-down or spillover effects. And consultancy then, GLA Economics, then argue that when London grows, the rest of the UK grows. So there's a rational argument, if you like, for corralling this investment then into London. And conversely then, this kind of approach or view argues then that if we want to try and address these social and spatial disparities, we would be wasting and spreading scarce resources too thinly across the rest of the UK and not supporting those places able to grow. Now others who take a rather different view then would see that this uneven geography is economically inefficient. That London is very vulnerable then to a whole series of overloads across various infrastructure sectors, that there are diseconomies or costs, if you like, from this spatial concentration of economic activities, such as unaffordable housing, and a whole series of these negative externalities or spillovers, congestion, poor air quality, and so on. And then in London, what happens is you get these supply bottlenecks, if you like, and constraints get reached in land, labour and housing markets then much more quickly than they do in other countries where you have a more evenly spread economic geography across the piece. So in this sense, this reading of the situation, if you like, this skewed geographical distribution of infrastructure investment means that London is getting much higher levels than other parts of the country per capita, and that is fueling discontent and holding back, if you like, the realisation of economic potential in other parts of the UK. And we see this from popular characters. This is Boris Johnson in his guise as Mayor of London back in 2012. Which makes a very clear argument, if you like, around the second point, this idea of the dominance of London as the economic engine and the tax revenue motor, if you like. It's strongly shaped national discussions around how we do public policy and government strategy. And the fact that government is located in this seat of economic and political power then in London means that national government for the UK often takes what's called a London-centric perspective on issues. And here we find that this uneven economic geography, the concentration of all these economic activities within London and the global city region then, has kind of reinforced this kind of centralised worldview, if you like, within the British and UK political economy. And indeed, if we have a look at it, the UK has one of the most centralised governance systems internationally. So if we look at this international comparative data from this regional authority index, this measures the decentralisation of powers and resources then across countries then. The UK sits just above Greece then in terms of its ranking and well below these much more decentralised countries such as Germany, Spain and Belgium. You'll note as well, and it's an interesting thing to ponder, that these were also the countries that were investing much more in relative terms in their infrastructure, so we can ponder and reflect on that in discussion perhaps. And if we look historically, we can see that the UK, this just plots regional authority index change from the 1950s up to 2010. We can see that the longer run picture again is one of relatively low and stable levels of decentralisation, punctuated by some really serious centralisation when the index fell greatly then through the 1980s and early 90s, and then it was kind of put back on track by late 1990s devolution to the devolved territories. Now, the uneven geography of economic activity and tax revenue generation then tends to further reinforce this centralised political economy. We have a continued and growing net surplus of tax receipts then, more than the public expenditure that actually goes into London, shows that it still has a positive net contribution to national public finances. If we look from the 1990s, except for a period around the crisis then, London and the South East have what the Treasury would call then a negative fiscal balance. They generate a surplus, if you like, that underpins a lot of redistribution across the rest of the country. Now, of course, the advocates then of our economic geography being as it is, would argue that, well, we can't then damage that national economic motor and tax revenue generator, otherwise we will be poorer and have less money to redistribute. Perhaps we'll come back to that in discussion. But what's actually happened then is this economic and political geography have overlaid and reinforced each other then to reproduce this kind of nationally skewed narrative. And certainly London actors and financial interests have been pushing this, arguing that London is this main engine of national economic growth and tax revenue generation. It's appropriate that we focus what public investment we have on dealing with these market failures, these supply bottlenecks, if you like, within the UK, because it's the most productive, the most prosperous part of the UK. And crucially, again, this argument goes, we should be investing in places that are able to realise economic success that can then be shared with the rest of the country. And often we end up then with a whole series of projects then that are deemed nationally important and of national significance that have very, very positive geographical impacts in London and its city region. Now, of course, this geographically skewed approach then hasn't always been the case. The UK hasn't always followed this kind of model of a great skewing and unevenness, if you like, in terms of its uneven infrastructure investment. Historically, in the post-war period then, we have a very distinctive version then of what Steve Graham and Simon Marvin called the modern infrastructure ideal, where there was a very centralised, top-down national framework of state management, Keynesian redistributive economic policy and the construction of a welfare state. It was marked by a whole series of one-nation politics, people can remember those, a commitment to redistribution, integration, modernisation and nation building that try to deliver a broadly comparable set of essential services to people at a similar cost across the country. And this was mostly realised through a whole series of monopolies in national infrastructure systems and services. So we can think with some fondness, perhaps horror, at British Railways, the Central Electricity Generating Board, the motorway network, post office telecommunications. Now, provision of such infrastructures at the time then was always seen then as a fundamental role for national government to deliver. It was paid for by revenues from general taxation with a bit of additional borrowing and some user fees. Now, of course, this UK version of the modern infrastructure ideal it was undermined then by the break-up of state-regulated mass production, mass consumption from the early 1970s, the emergence of deindustrialisation and contraction of our manufacturing base, the rise of a service-led economy, rising inflation and unemployment, internationalisation, technological change. This transition eroded tax bases then. It generated growing national and city government indebtedness and a fiscal crisis in the 70s that kind of heralded a turn towards a much more market-oriented kind of political economy within the UK. So that next period then from the 1970s then was marked by a much more socially and geographically uneven fragmentation, a splintering, if you like, of that national modern infrastructure ideal. We had a whole series of deregulations, privatisations and sell-offs of these national monopolies. They break up the introduction of competition and financialisation. And you got infrastructure networks were split up or unbundled at the time, the idea being to reduce costs and prices, increase consumer choice, and this was often to the disadvantage then of poorer people and places across the country. And you've got a whole series of moves going on at this point. Shifts towards private interests, public-private partnerships, finance actor engagement, and an antipathy, if you like, to public ownership and management. And national and local government at this time then were fundamentally criticised then for underinvestment, causing an infrastructure crisis, not securing sufficient participation of private investment, and a whole series of attempts were made then to try and reframe infrastructure items and systems then from what were failing public goods in public hands, if you like, into potentially lucrative assets that could be kind of opened up by finance. And you've got a whole series of funding and financing changes then that were really characterised then by mixed public-private hybrid forms of arrangements. Now this fragmentation and splintering then is fundamental to the story then in terms of explaining this geographically uneven infrastructure provision across the country. When you got the demise then of a national Keynesian settlement and a one-nation politics, you started to see a much more fragmented picture emerge. You started to see London and its city region, if you like, assert its interest at the national level in terms of its importance as the economic motor and tax revenue generator within the UK. You've got organisations like London First, the kind of business association in London, arguing back in 2012, in the period following the Second World War, we made a conscious choice not to grow London and instead plan for its decline. an approach that was to the detriment of the UK as a whole. So you get a feeling, a flavour of the way in which the arguments kind of shifted, if you like, towards dealing with those infrastructure issues then in London and its city region then, because that was a national issue, because of the way in which the economic geography was shifting. And the third one, and again this is for the Anoraks, was really about understanding the geographical bias then in infrastructure investment and how it's become ingrained in how government administration works. There's such a thing called the Treasury's Green Book. A few of you at least, I think, will know what we're talking about here, which is a kind of guidance manual from the Finance Ministry in the UK. This specifies how public sector actors then have to appraise the costs and benefits then of public intervention and expenditure. It's going to be like a busman's holiday for a few of them, I'm sure. And this way of assessing these cases for public investment then is based on calculating their current economic or market value, and it's rated using benefit cost ratios. Now this method produces very geographically skewed outcomes because you've got projects located in more productive and stronger economies across the UK. These tend to have higher current economic or market value, so you think about house prices or wages in London and the Greater South East, for example, and therefore they, when calculated, tend to generate higher benefit cost ratios. Now these projects then, with the higher benefit cost ratios, tend to get authorised and given the go-ahead ahead of projects then that are located in weaker and less productive economies. Because these places tend to have the lower economic and market values, the wages are lower, the house prices are lower, and their benefit cost ratios as a result are lower. So if we take the example then of, got that one there, in terms of Boris Johnson, again in his guise as Mayor of London back in 2012 then, he argued that actually it was more productive then to actually spend money then in London as a way of helping Strathclyde, because that was a more efficient way then of using scarce public resources at the time. And what you also got as well then was a whole series of kind of investment decisions then that were being shaped by these kinds of benefit cost ratio calculations. So The Economist, this kind of market-friendly magazine, cites the example then of investment to replace these infamous pacer trains in northern England that was calculated to produce something like 35 pence in benefit for each pound of public investment cost. That was compared then to Crossrail trains then that was seen to generate £2.10 for every pound invested from the public purse. So you've got a kind of skewing through that project appraisal mechanism then towards forms of investment and that were reinforcing that uneven geography to public investment then within the London and South East region. And Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, you saw a picture of him earlier, then has been very critical of this approach then. He argued that when you just judge projects then on these economic value, then parts of the country where the economy was strongest were more likely to score highest in terms of this appraisal process, and no weighting was being given then to the kinds of places then that had higher social need or weaker economies that actually needed the investment to realise their economic potential and kickstart their broader economies. So thirdly, that kind of ingrained appraisal mechanism then is part and parcel then of skewing and explaining this kind of ingrained uneven geography to investment. And the last one is really in the context of that historical underinvestment that we saw from the 1960s in public investment, is that we've seen a kind of reinforcement of that since 2010, as you saw the acceleration, if you like, in public expenditure reductions following the crisis and the introduction of austerity. And the question here, of course, is when there are scarce resources to go around, and if London is being allocated the bulk of the available investment, and this is really because of its dominant position then within that broader economic geography and political economy, then it leaves very little then for other areas within the UK to actually invest. Now, you've had some debate about this. You've had some political leaders across the piece then arguing then for more investment across the country. It's not a kind of zero-sum game. But when resources are scarce, when the priority is about kick-starting the national economy after the crisis and trying to get economic recovery going, then this becomes a bit more of a nuanced argument. So what you've got then are local governments across the UK then and other agencies then confronting a public expenditure squeeze, unprecedented since for many decades, very limited decentralisation and a very centralised system, and this very skewed infrastructure geography where they're desperate to pull together funds to invest in their economic potential. And they've been forced into these kind of new strategies and practices, if you like, to try and attempt to fund and finance local infrastructure. So this is Sir Albert Bohr, who's a former leader of Birmingham City Council down in the West Midlands then. He called this the jaws of doom then that local authorities have been facing, where since coalition government's kind of public expenditure reductions programme then, you've had an ageing population and these kind of huge demands growing very quickly on local authorities in terms of need for spending and budget pressures, and then this falling resource then in terms of grant reductions then from central government was producing this jaws of doom effect on local government. And basically this was kind of pushing local governments then across the country then to get more involved then in a whole series of new financialised, and this is much of what the book talks about, practices and activities. So whether this be about trying to offset expenditure reductions by buying assets like shopping centres to generate revenue streams so that the local authorities can still deliver their statutory services, whether it's involved borrowing against future tax revenues that might be uncertain, even getting credit ratings and issuing bonds, other forms of borrowing that local authorities have been involved in. Now, of course, this has kind of increased local government's borrowing levels. There's a lot more detail in the book. It's committed then to long-term contracts that might be a little bit more costly to negotiate as their priorities and conditions change. And also these new arrangements are a lot more risky, speculative and uncertain than the kinds of things that local governments used to get involved in historically. And of course, on the other side of the coin, you can see financial actors then that see a booming market in advising local governments in these new forms of practices and advice. So you've got local government demand, if you like, meeting financial institution supply that's been kind of broadening, deepening, accelerating, if you like, the shift from the kind of old tried and tested fees, borrowing and taxes towards these new instruments like asset leasing and revolving funds to try and bring forward kind of money from the future to today's funding to actually invest in infrastructure. So what you've got then is these kind of four elements that fit together to explain this uneven, spatially skewed geography of infrastructure then in the UK. You've got this uneven geography and these long-standing spatial and social disparities. You've got the economic and political dominance of London. You've got a highly centralised governance system. You've got this skewed appraisal, project appraisal system. And you've got these kind of constraints bearing down upon local government. And of course, in the context of London's growth and its central place within this political economy then, its infrastructure needs and demands then are not static, they're not standing still, they're still growing into the future. And some recent estimates then of future infrastructure investment for London then are in the order of £1.3 trillion up to 2050, most of this being concentrated in these basic services around housing and transport. So national UK government then is effectively trapped in some ways into supporting this infrastructure investment in the UK's economic engine. The priority is really much focused then on servicing this concentration of economic activity in the London City region and trying to defer the point at which these kind of overheating labour, land and housing markets then kind of create these negative spillovers of congestion, of unaffordable housing and deteriorating environmental conditions within London and the greater South East. Now, of course, we would hope that these kind of incentives, if you like, for dispersal, for pushing out economic activities beyond London and its city region, then end up being a secondary concern, if you like, within this broader debate. Now, of course, you've got the Treasury's own view, have even argued that the costs of infrastructure provision in London then are actually rising. So, if you've got fewer resources, larger projects, those are going to get soaked up very quickly then in this geographically skewed infrastructure system. And building in crowded cities, in the likes of London, if you like, costs a lot more than constructing infrastructure then on greenfield sites. So with this geographically uneven infrastructure provision then, you've got a whole series of things that are undermining national UK government claims then to effect some kind of spatial rebalancing, closing the gap between the rich and poor regions, or in current lexicon, levelling up across the country, which seems to be the discussion that's taking place within the general election campaign. And what you're left with then are cities and regions then elsewhere in the UK then that risk being left behind in the shadow then of the London City region and its rising demands and costs of infrastructure provision and its actors' claims then upon national public expenditure. Let's move towards some conclusions then, and then we can have some reflections and some broader discussion about this. So this contemporary moment seems to have very distinct echoes then of the Barlow report on the distribution of industrial population from the 1940s in the UK. And Barlow at the time expressed concerns about what he saw as persistent geographical inequalities in the UK that connected growth in London and the greater South East core of the economy to underdevelopment then in the city and regions elsewhere in the periphery. Now, such issues, we could argue, have actually returned and crystallised around infrastructure as that geographical inequality in the spatial distribution of investment across the UK is revealed, and as we've discussed this evening. And with infrastructure now once more a central part then of our political economic discussion in the UK then, what we were trying to do this evening then was to try and examine its relationships then to these social and geographical inequalities and its very highly centralised governance system within the UK. And we see this, even as I said, the liberal market-friendly magazine The Economist then, is always bemoaning how outside London people will discover infrastructure that looks like it comes from another poorer country. It also acknowledges then that a divide exists between London and the rest, and that the question of whether fixing infrastructure in the London city region then is undermining the rest of the UK then is not just my concern or our concern in the book then, but something of broader interest within the political economy. And we try to argue then that the UK's geographically uneven infrastructure provision then has been trapped into servicing then the needs of this national economic engine and tax revenue generator in London and its city region. And this is limiting and constraining then the realisation of economic potential then in the rest of the country. And we've seen this recognised nationally in the Queen's speech back in October 2019 then government had a plan then to develop a national infrastructure strategy, many of these, with an explicit aim then that the benefits of a prospering economy will reach every corner of the United Kingdom. Similarly, the London Chamber of Commerce then has argued that London's heading towards megacity status with 10 million people by 2030. I'm quoting here, while we seek the right infrastructure here, it's important that the rest of the country continues to grow as well. At present, cross-country travelling between the great northern cities of Liverpool, Manchester, Leeds and Sheffield, we'll add Newcastle, is a tortuous, time-consuming experience that is not good for business or Britain plc. So what then can be done about this situation? How can we use infrastructure to address the deep and persistent social and geographical inequalities and highly centralised government within the UK? Now, inspired by our multidisciplinary work within this iBuild Research Centre, then we had a few ideas that we put forward, and they're articulated more in the book. First, then, we can change the way we think about infrastructure. We want to try and work against this idea of its transformation from a collective public good into an asset class. We want to try and reframe and ask the question then of what kind of infrastructure and for who. And our answer is that we need a people and place rather than a finance-centred approach to understanding infrastructure. And if we have a people and place-based perspective, we can try and provide access to high quality, affordable, convenient and reliable services and protection from risk. All the things that we think are important about infrastructure at a very fundamental level. And if we widen beyond this very narrow, solely economic and financial focus then, we can see infrastructure then as a means through which people can actually try and connect with their wider social, environmental, cultural and political opportunities for human fulfilment and well-being. And we can also prompt thinking about how we can do all that then in much more sustainable ways, both in economic, social and environmental terms. Because at the minute, we're kind of stuck into channeling cities and regions towards financial institutions and often the kinds of infrastructure that they want to fund, perhaps, rather than the kind of infrastructure that cities and regions actually need. And if we think in this way, the people and place-based approach, we can try and open up some possibilities then of alternative approaches. New ideas then are needed then for funding, financing and governing infrastructure, we would argue. We identified many as part of our work with the iBuild Research Centre. So maybe developing new state-led institutions, regional development banks, for example, backed up by a UK sovereign guarantee, able to access low-cost borrowing for investment. Trying to develop new and more social forms of collective and mutual ownership. Developing new configurations then of public, private and civic joint working. And maybe thinking about new ways of regulating and forms of taxation that we could link into infrastructure investment. And if we have such an approach, we would argue then that you've got a way to return to and try and reinforce the public dimensions then of infrastructure. These are the kinds of things that are integral to what Carol Williams and colleagues then called a foundational economy of universal basic services that are really important in providing these essential underpinnings then of civilised everyday life and collective consumption. And we've got a bit of progress on these things. The Industrial Strategy Commission have talked about this idea of universal basic infrastructure. In the iBuild Research Centre, we talked about an infrastructure service guarantee. and both of which are about trying to ensure that there's appropriate provision then of infrastructure, hard and soft forms of infrastructure that enable and support all people and places across the country then to realise their potential and opportunities. Secondly then is the idea of actually having meaningful decentralisation of powers and resources, trying to enable cities and regions on the ground to have more people-centred and place-based infrastructure strategies that are tailored to their specific needs. And in this way then we might be able to kind of realise, mobilise the untapped economic potential then of countries across the piece, trying to deal with the UK's weak productivity then by investing across the country rather than just trying to squeeze a little bit more productivity out of the already high-performing London city region. And then we can try and get people places across the country to deal with this division and discontent then, if they have access to infrastructures then that enables them to contribute positively then to a national collective project rather than being perceived then as some kind of drain, if you like, on the national economy and public purse. Now, of course, changing the way we think about infrastructure then has got to have some links back into what happens in the centre, as we've described, in a very centralised system, in national government, in the civil service in Whitehall. There's very important reforms to be had. And in terms of national economic strategy, the UK, at least for the moment, has a higher credit rating internationally, is able to borrow to invest in infrastructure in the context of very low interest rates internationally. And even the UK National Audit Office then have estimated that interest rates then for government borrowing were around 3.3, 3.4%, compared to something like 7.4 or 7.5% for accessing private finance. So it makes commercial and financial sense then for the state to be borrowing to invest. And you've got economics Nobel Economics Prize winner Paul Krugman, much for the New York Times now, argues that now is the time to borrow to invest, as he says, because spending more now would mean a bigger economy later, it would be more tax revenue, larger than any rise in future interest payments, and it would also boost job creation too. And you've even got the UK's Independent Office for Budget Responsibility have argued that the fiscal multiplier then of capital spending, investment in infrastructure then, is between 1 and 1.3. So that means that if you had a 1% increase in national capital spending then, that would boost GDP then by 1 or 1.3%. You're generating further tax revenues to repay the borrowing that you've already secured at a lower interest rate. So there are mechanisms here to do this. It's just about the political economy and the will to be able to put these in place. We would argue as well for a few reforms to work through that Treasury Green Book appraisal process, but we won't bore you with those at the moment. So just to finish off then, so if we're going to tackle these kind of fixes then for the London City Region's infrastructure and the way in which it's constraining and undermining efforts in the rest of the UK then, this is really the landscape, we would argue, upon which this future articulation then of socially rather than financially useful infrastructure then will need to take place. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward then to the reflections of Simon and Rich and your comments and questions from the wider audience. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you very much, Andy, for a thought-provoking lecture, also for inviting us to be the first to reflect on it. You raised a provocative question in the title of your lecture, to which your answer was a resounding yes, that fixing infrastructure in London undermines the rest of the UK. As you said, the headlines are all about growing inequalities and widening gaps, especially between the North and the South. The danger of hearing these headlines repeatedly is that we begin to take them for granted as normal facts of life and stop asking the crucial question that you, Andy, asked in your lecture: why these inequalities persist. You showed us how a combination of 4 factors has created a vicious cycle which perpetuates the unequal geography of infrastructure and keeps the country on a two-nation path. On reflection, I wonder if we should add another layer to your in-depth analysis by asking what lies behind these factors? What binds them together? Are they the root causes of our geographical divides, or are they themselves the manifestations of a certain political ideology? One that since the 1970s has radically and deliberately changed public sector's role in the provision of social and physical infrastructures, to the extent that today market logics and principles play to every register of our imagination and determine the design and delivery of our public services. So, and as you said, infrastructure is no longer seen as a public good. Instead, it's become a profit-seeking investment, which inevitably goes to places where the returns are higher, rather than where the needs are greater. And the biggest problem is that such an ideologically driven approach is often dressed up as a technical or economically rational one, driven by the seemingly objective project appraisal of the Green Book that you mentioned, while in fact, the methodology itself in the Green Book is designed according to a set of specific views about how infrastructure should be planned and funded and for whom. And this ideology does have a name, even though we don't tend to talk about it. It's called neoliberalism, and is founded on a strong belief in the ability of the market to sort out all of our social, spatial, and environmental problems. The term collective, which you rightly mentioned in your call for action towards the end of your lecture, rarely features in its vocabularies. And fairness is not necessarily its most sought-after value. You're right that geographical inequalities are not new, and neither are the politicians' promises of tackling them. Back in 1962, Harold Macmillan promised, and I quote, to prevent two nations developing geographically, a poor north and a rich south. His words, not mine. Because he then added, the price of failure would be that our successors will reproach us as we reproach the Victorians for complacency about slums. Well, 60 years on, people in the north are still waiting for the promised land of a one-nation country. They are still waiting for a fair share of investment. And crucially, they're still waiting for a proper recognition of their contribution to the country. But what they've got so far are unfulfilled promises, plus the misleading label of left behind places. It is misleading because the narrative ignores the fact that places are not simply left behind. They are kept behind by decades of chronic underinvestment in social and physical infrastructure, as you brilliantly demonstrated tonight. So thank you again for a wonderful lecture.
Okay, thank you. So yes, Andy, in answer to your question, absolutely yes. In fact, the first thing you reminded me of was not so much an engineering perspective, but Liebig's law of minimum. So for those of you who aren't scientists, Liebig is famous for his condenser that you might have used in school chemistry labs, but also identifying that growth is not limited by total resources, but the scarcest of those resources. And when you had that list, you've been talking a lot about resources being taken from other places. You had a list of infrastructure projects for transport investments, of water investments, and it just occurred to me that actually there's this sort of self-perpetuating cycle of the transport system's not big enough, we need to grow it. The water network's not big enough, we need to grow it, and so on and so on. And we have seen examples around the world, and Delhi, I think, is a particularly notable one of a city that is quite literally choking itself, underperforming relative to even its regions in terms of growth because it cannot go any further. It is literally at capacity in terms of its infrastructure, and that is now holding it back. But as an engineer, I think one of the things I've always found frustrating is that we're often involved in the design of infrastructure far too late in the process. Someone has already decided they want to put a bridge from A to B, whereas really we should be taking a step back and thinking about what is the outcome we need. Do we need a bridge to get from A to B, or are there other ways of achieving that? And I think this is what you're alluding to with your sort of people and place perspective. And I'm just thinking about it more in terms of nuts, bolts, and girders. But this is what again I think is reflected in a lot of our thinking. What is the outcome? For what? For who? And how? Who gets the value from that infrastructure intervention? And one of the ways that engineers, I think, can try and contribute to this is perhaps through innovation in design. Engineering is derived from the term ingenuity, or the same root anyway. And I think there are lots of things that we can start to do just within the sort of framework that we do have to operate in, because unfortunately we can't start from a blank sheet of paper a lot of the time. And that might be through, if you like, dealing with either sort of the way we supply infrastructure, so that could be the materials that we use, or the manufacturing approaches, trying to reducing that kind of cost, making it more efficient and delivering better services for less. But it could also be in terms of perhaps trying to think about the demand for it. It comes back to that bridge again. Do we actually really need to build it in the first place? And we shouldn't always be assuming that building more stuff is good, because actually if we can manage and lower our demand for these services, then we will help them last longer. That again in this as well, I think we also there are some really nice examples of where people coming together across different sectors have actually been quite ingenious. So in this country, as Andy set out, there's quite a lot of fragmentation, not just within individual sectors where we've kind of broken up our infrastructure networks to be managed in quite different and fragmented ways, but between different sectors as well. And if you want to kind of build a flood defence in this country, and the benefit-cost ratio, I might come back to this in a moment, you need to have a benefit-to-cost ratio of 8 to 1. £8 returned for every £1 of investment. We heard a number of examples of transport infrastructure investment there that were closer to 2 to 1 or even less. In Kuala Lumpur, they come up with an ingenious way of tackling this by combining the two. Building a tunnel to move traffic around the city, but during the monsoon season, that doubles up as a giant storm drain, quite deliberately, unlike in Hurricane Sandy in New York, which when the tunnels there flooded, that really wasn't intentional. And so this tunnel, it provides dual functions, and that actually can help make both the transport and the storm drain systems more resilient. It provides that sort of better return, and it's all about ingenious design. And the benefit cost, though, it does have its use, I think, but you cited numerous examples of where it falls down. It's not very good at coping with that intangible stuff, how we feel, the social and the environmental benefits, the health benefits, which do actually have a huge economic value, but we're really tough to kind of quantify and put into that benefit cost framework that has been imposed upon so much infrastructure investment. One of my kind of personal bugbears, I do a lot of work in terms of managing environmental risks, is actually the long time frame that many of these decisions need to be considered over. That if we're thinking about rising sea levels, changing climates, that we need to put in place infrastructure that lasts for decades, centuries even. And yet, the benefit cost framework actually discounts, ignores the benefits we get 100 years from now from the infrastructure we put in place today. And yet, if you were to look at the benefits we get, and coming back to London, from Bazalgette's sewer system there, several hundred years worth of return, and I'm sure no one would discount the benefits that that system still provides today. So I think we do need to rethink our values, and I do think we need to re-emphasise our priorities in engineering design. But sometimes a bit of leadership helps as well. The Thames Barrier, people struggled with it ever since the 1953 storm surge that flooded parts of London, struggled to justify that investment, despite the fact it was protecting, still then, some of the most expensive real estate in the country, as well as the House of Parliament. It took decades to actually get it built. It finally opened in 1986. And part of the argument that was ultimately made was the chief scientist, Sir Herman Bondi, just came forward and said, look, we cannot allow London to flood. It's as simple as that. Sod benefit cost, we just have to have some common sense and make that investment. And I think sometimes with some of these things we need to be a bit more sensible and thoughtful about what we're doing and why we're doing it, and get rid of some of these technocratic measures that maybe create some distraction. Thank you.
Wonderful. We have some time for questions and discussions, as Andy invited. If I could ask you to catch my eye, please, I'll direct one of our microphones to you. Just over here, please, gentleman with the hand up there. And over this side, possibly. If you, when you get the microphone, if you hold it close to your, close to when you speak, and speak into it so everyone in the room can hear your question. That would be great. Thank you very much.
I think switched on this is. I think you've hit on the problem. These structures, these infrastructure projects are long-term. Politics is, as we know at the moment, extremely short-term. There's an ability to look beyond a year or two, maybe 5 years, maybe a parliament. And that actually seems to me to be the big problem. And I don't know whether there's any answer to this, because in the nature of politicians, they want to be in power and they don't want to contribute, to spend so much money for benefits that may come in decades.
Oh, do you want to do one at a time? Yes, on the front row, please.
Hi, well, partially in response to that, I will say that I think that this is about the difference in investment in the north and the south, particularly. And I'm Chion Moore. I'm currently the candidate for Newcastle Central for the elections. But I'm also a chartered electrical engineer who worked in engineering for 20 years before going into Parliament. And my last job was as regulating infrastructure as part of Ofcom, Office of Communications. And I just thought the contributions were fantastic, Andy and Silam and Richard. And actually, I'm not going to be political because you made all the political points that I would have made. But just 2 points, 2 things. I think that another additional issue is the role of the kind of like financialization, whereby the returns, the short-term returns, which come from moving figures around in hedge funds, etc., attract, drawing financial investment generally leaving less for investment in infrastructure. And also, and this is something that I really found in Ofcom, that in economics generally, that we can measure the costs, but we can't actually cost the benefits. And particularly the benefits when it comes to differentials in investment between the North and the South, the benefit of social cohesion, the benefit of having a country where people are, are equally, or at least, relatively equally able to benefit from a shared sense of purpose and also a shared sense of reward. So we need to do much more to recognise that. But I suppose my question actually is, and just to say that Labour released its manifesto for the North East, which had significant investment in it, and also some political reorganisation. Do you think, and it was really interesting what you said about the project assessments, do you think that this can be changed by changing process? Or do we actually need to move people and decision makers north to effect change?
Apologies, Andy, it's a comment that I know it was something that we discussed a lot when we were writing the book. I'm going through ex-Kurd and now urban foresight, and with a finance background, which is probably why I'm going to make this point. I think we often talk about the demands of infrastructure and the supply, where will the supply come of capital to meet that? And actually, as you know, I think probably it's the opposite. It's the demands of surplus capital, and it's infrastructure partly that is being deployed, infrastructure investment, to meet that need. And what I mean by that is that we're dealing with a problem of the oversupply globally of surplus capital. We're looking at pension pots, of which 93% of global pensions are concentrated in 7 countries. We're dealing with sovereign surpluses, either from fossil fuel exploitation, Norway, Middle East, North America, or trade surpluses, China, Singapore. And these surpluses are further concentrated by infrastructure funds who are located where those investors either are or where those investors wish to deploy their funds as a hedge against their own economic uncertainties. And they tend to focus also in areas of the Anglo-Saxon language and law. So you end up with these very overheated markets. And such surpluses are at record levels. We've got record low interest rates, we've got unattractive bond markets, volatile equity markets, and so the answer is, where is this money going to go? It's gone into real estate markets, but it's also gone into a new asset class that, as one investor who you'll recall I interviewed said, if infrastructure as an asset class didn't exist, we'd have to invent it. And why? It's because it's low volatility, it's long duration, it's essential, it's physical, which is quite attractive compared to the collateralized debt obligations of the recent crisis, and it's a kind of proxy for sovereign risk, and all at a significant premium over gilts. And these are incredibly attractive to these investors, but because these investors have so much to deploy, they want to deploy at scale. They don't want to invest 5 million, 10 million, they ideally want to invest 100 million, 200 million, 500 million, $1 billion. And that scale can sometimes mitigate against regional investment projects. So I just want to kind of put that out there as, it's easy to focus on the infrastructure piece. I don't think we should forget the surplus capital piece in all of this.
Okay, well, fantastic questions and issues raised there. I'll try and say a few things in response to these. I think you're certainly right in terms of the political cycle of infrastructure, necessarily hugely capital intensive in many cases, very, very long term in terms of its costs and benefits and how it's paid for. The UK, like many other countries, has attempted to try and develop institutional arrangements. So we have a National Infrastructure Commission, which the idea of which was to try and take big infrastructure decisions out of that political cycle and 4 or 5-year parliaments as we're now in the UK. And I think that may be, it's more of an advisory body. It doesn't really have much statutory powers. So in terms of influencing the government of the day to, as you say, commit investment now for benefits that they won't experience because they'll be decades in advance, I think it doesn't well, maybe we should be charitable and say the jury's out, I suppose, in terms of that system, because it hasn't been in place for that long. I think what it also does as well, and I think we showed some figures from the National Infrastructure Construction Pipeline, it takes a very national view of these issues, which again, when you've got a very skewed economic geography and an even provision of infrastructure, then that national picture then is necessarily uneven. So in the book, I think we address the fact that I think a couple of the earliest reports that the National Infrastructure Commission published then were about building rail links between Oxford and Cambridge and dealing with some transport issues in London city region. So a National Infrastructure Commission is still bound, if you like, by that underlying kind of unevenness. I think that's one of the things we're kind of battling with, really. On Chief's point, I think, I mean, I guess there is this sense, I suppose, of trying to break with a very centralised London perspective, the London-centric view, if you like, of these issues, which might be helped by some movement of bits of government dispersing, decentralising some decision-making, but I think you might have more practical sort of earlier stage wins then by simply encouraging those actors in cities and regions to use more of there is supplementary guidance. We're getting really serious right now. In the back bits, the appendices in the Green Book, and colleagues Andy Brown in Leeds was closely involved with the Treasury in developing this. There are other ways of bringing in more social, equity, environmental sources of valuation that can be used to calculate and to weight and to do those benefit-cost ratio calculations in different ways. But I think what tends to happen, and what we found in the research, is that actors in cities and regions want to try and make the strongest case possible, so they tend to focus in on the economic rationale and arguments for these things. And then, of course, they get pitched into these competition then on economic terms with projects that are going to almost structurally, systematically generate these high benefit cost ratios in other parts of the country. So that's what they're kind of battling against. So maybe a bit of process and use of what's in the Green Book and its appendices today, as well as a bit of kind of meaningful decentralisation and dispersal of the government apparatus. I think when we've seen dispersal in the past, it's often been lower level, routine kind of service assembly type functions as an analogue to manufacturing, rather than decision making and kind of key actors then moving outside London. I mean, people argue now that you'd have to do a more systematic study than I'm about to claim now in a moment, but people would argue that Greater Manchester has been in the news a lot more now since the BBC moved to Salford. So that's something to ponder. Graham, it's always great to be challenged. We had a great time writing this book and discussing on these issues. Graham's absolutely right and did a fantastic PhD study which looked at that supply side of capital, bringing all his experience and expertise around finance, and the book is no doubt stronger for it. I think the issue in documenting that wall of money that's often described in terms of looking for ways to invest in infrastructure, national and local governments have gone down the road, I think, of trying to sort of secure those forms of often international money. But of course that wall of money wants returns. It's not going to invest in infrastructure projects in cities and regions on the never-never without an appropriate balance of risk and maturity of return. So they have to be packaged up in such a way that they are investable propositions for these sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, other financial institutions. So that's where often actors in cities and regions they will struggle then to try and portray these things, as Graham was suggesting, at scale, at an appropriate way in which these investors can get involved. And it's it's no coincidence then that cities like Birmingham have a sovereign wealth prospectus. There is a Northern Powerhouse pitch book that's attempting to kind of parlay these investment opportunities in cities and regions in places like Greater Manchester, where that shot's taken from, in ways that they can try and channel some of that wall of capital, if you like, into the kinds of investment projects they want. But again, it comes back to this issue then. Are we then left with cities and regions that are securing investment and finance for the kinds of projects that the financial actors want to fund, or the kind of projects that the cities and regions actually need? And that is, I think, a big question.
I've got two questions over here. I'm in the market for a third final question, so thank you very much.
Hi, Richard Baker. Thank you, Andy. A fantastic set of observations. There are loads of questions. I will restrict myself to two, if that's okay, but I've got more food on the time. Firstly, Right at the beginning, you presented a really broad definition of infrastructure. It ranged from everything from housing to transport through to natural capital and social capital. And then we've had a sort of very strong analysis of the sort of financial flows that are potentially trying to resource that infrastructure. I wonder, are there some parts of that wide definition of infrastructure where your analysis suggests that they're more sensitive in terms of long-term benefits to the country, and some of those you would leave out of the discussion? Because it seems to me that you're including a whole series of a very broad definition of infrastructure if you're going to restrict some of that investment. So I just wondered whether you'd sort of define some priorities to it. And then the second one, I just wondered where your analysis takes you on some of the the really big infrastructure projects that were on your table, like HS2 and Heathrow Landing 3, where this is a story about north-south connectivity or north-south connectivity to the world, and there's potentially a win-win in that argument, although the aggregate is probably going to distribute to the south. So where does it take you with those sorts of issues?
And just behind.
You mentioned about the removal of places from the north, or their removal, and I wanted to just ask about the fact that there has been significant investment in the north, particularly in the area of railways and investment in new rolling stock. While I'm not saying it's at the same level as it's seen in the south, is it worth consideration of the political rhetoric as to how that is perceived and seen on a national level? Because people like Andy Burnham do still speak very critically of railways in the north, and particularly of Northern as a rail operator, and how does that affect the perceived investment?
And our last question, right in the far corner on the left.
Do you think there's a case to be made in defence of technocracy? I mean, some of the examples you cited, Crossrail had a benefit, BCR with its old costs of just around 2. DLR extensions 1.5, Jubilee line extension 1.5. The cycle super highways in London either under 2 or negative in some cases, so actually making the country worse. But things like the Leeds Supertram had 4 or 5, very much higher BCRs, but they weren't funded for non-appraisal reasons. Are other things aside from appraisal sometimes much more important, and it's convenient to forget appraisal when you want?
Okay. I mean, again, just to try and respond to some of these very pertinent points, I think. Certainly, I mean, we are kind of casting the definition wide, I suppose, in terms of infrastructure to try and open up the discussion a little bit, to try and move just beyond the very narrow economic hard infrastructure kind of discussion. And really in the context of trying to think about people and places, to try and to get places, I guess, to think in a much broader sense about the kind of infrastructure they need. This goes back to Rich's profound point about, is the bridge the answer to the question? Or it might be if you take those steps back to actually think more widely then about the kinds of infrastructures that that you want to invest in and actually prioritise within places. And are we sort of getting infrastructure prioritised in a very centralised governance structure with financial interests involved with it that are not necessarily what cities and regions actually want and need? So it's really a kind of a claim to try and open up the definition of infrastructure in that deliberate way to have that wider discussion. And it might be that it narrows down through the deliberation of cities and regions around a series of economic infrastructures that are quite narrowly confined, and that's fine, but that's not for a central government perhaps or a set of financial interests maybe to determine beforehand. On the big infrastructure projects, I mean, of course, a lot of the discussion and deliberation controversy around HS2. John is around. John Tommy, my co-author on the book from UCL, has written about this. The way in which evidence and kind of discussion and deliberation and a political imperative to do this as a symbol of rebalancing within the broader economy then was obviously pertinent in terms of this infrastructure. It speaks to your point as well in terms of the politics kind of pervading these technocratic discussions. And we have to ask ourselves with the likes of that is why, when some interests in the north would have argued that you should have been doing the high-speed bit in the north first then, rather than reducing the travel time and adding capacity then between London and Birmingham. So again, it's about trying to kick the question back into what are you actually trying to do with this infrastructure I think, which is important for those kinds of discussions. I think your point about the PACEs and the investment, I mean, certainly, if we were to go back and try and update and look at the Treasury's kind of official figures, then there is a creeping up, perhaps, of investment in recent years. I think you'd see that in the figures, but as we showed you nationally and also in terms of the regional spread, then you're building from a very low base to try and get things back up. And the under-investment legacy, if you like, I think has very, very kind of long shadows that it casts, I think, over the infrastructure systems and services. So I think if you were starting to try and think about what kind of figures you'd need for this kind of catch-up to get infrastructure on a kind of, an appropriate level, and what might that appropriate level be? I think that's a very interesting point to reflect upon. So it's a very good question that you asked there. And still, we see these ingrained differences in per capita figures. That's trying to standardise for the size of these regions. You're just not getting as much as investment in these places as perhaps they need. You might even, if you wanted to be more radical about it, argue that the per capita investments then should tilt the other way to try and get the catch-up that you want. I mean, maybe that's part of the discussion and debate raised by this too. And certainly, I mean, we touched upon it. It's a very good point that, for all the benefit cost ratios and appraisal analysis in the world, then it's the politics often that's driving this, which you were alluding to there with that point. And again, John and colleague John Tomley has done some very good work, I think, looking at the ways in which the numbers were cooked up by various interests, if you like, for HS2 in terms of its benefit cost ratios to try and provide this kind of substantive, objective, in inverted commas, rationale then for making those kinds of investments. But again, you have to ask, why is it that investments in tram systems and in a city like Leeds then can have a much bigger number and still not get funded at the end of the day? And for us in the book, I think we go back to that argument that this is a skewed narrative. The system is rigged, if you like, and focused upon channeling that scarce investment into London and its city region then. Even when the objective figures, as you're saying, on the benefit cost ratios, then would suggest you might put that money somewhere else.
Unlike some of the projects we've been discussing this evening, coming on time, perfectly at 7 o'clock, with an amazingly content-rich talk and series of questions for discussion. Thank you very much for coming this evening. Would you join me in thanking our speaker? Thank you very much.